So as we start wrapping up our day, I'd like to invite our next two speakers. Margaret Biggs, who is a Matthews Fellow in Global Public Policy at my alma mater, Queen's University, and John McArthur, who's the Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. And they will be sharing a roadmap on the next steps. Now that we've had all these rich conversations, how do we move forward in realizing the SDGs in Canada? John and Margaret, I'm going to pass it over to the both of you.
Thank you very much. And a huge thank you to the organizers, to the amazing moderators and the sponsors. We couldn't have this event last year, and I think this year, again, together Ensemble, we've been able to bring so many different actors and voices together, new people, new voices to the table. So it's just
Margaret, sorry, apologies, Margaret. I think something's covering your camera. There you go. We lost you for a sec.
Oh, okay. Sorry, can you see me? Okay, so yeah, John and I have been asked not to sum up the conference, but to give some thoughts, I guess, as we close out the conference on where do we go from here. And I have listened into a lot of the sessions, and they've been hugely inspiring, because despite all the crises that we're facing and all the world events that we're all trying to get our heads around, I've heard many people say that the SDGs are more relevant than ever, more important than ever. They point out the interconnections amongst our issues, our communities, our sectors in a way that now become even more significant and more salient for Canadians. There have been people who have the climate crisis, whether it's the war in Ukraine and the importance of SDG 16. COVID has laid bare all kinds of inequities and fault lines in our society. And again, these crises have, to a certain extent, sapped our energy and taken our focus. But they've also shown why and how important the SDGs are as a framework, as a North Star for our collective actions. I've been really impressed and amazed and inspired by how many people and sectors have talked about how the SDGs they've almost had epiphanies. I think that's what Denise Amiot said yesterday in terms of colleges and university and institutes of Canada, that all of us, that, you know, the COVID has made them realize that these issues aren't far away. These issues are in our communities and our towns across our country. And they've turned their work as universities and institutes Canada to really embedding the SDGs in everything they do down through their institutions. That's a huge, huge undertaking. So, and it's inspiring that from coast to coast to coast, really, how much action and energy there is. That said, and I think what I'd like to say here today is that as amazing as all these efforts are, it's just not enough. It's just not enough because it's not systemic enough yet. It's not fast enough yet. It's not connected enough yet. And it is March 2022. And we're almost halfway to 2030. And Canada is not on track. I haven't seen recent official numbers, but actually John did some of the most important and path-breaking work on whether or not Canada was on track to achieve the SDGs. And we weren't, and we aren't. So despite all this amazing energy and grassroots efforts and new voices and et cetera, we're not where we need to be. Some major sectors, some governments are still in a planning and awareness phase. And there's a risk that these crises are going to divert our attention. So now is the time, and I heard this in multiple sessions, now's the time for acceleration. And a lot of people use the transformation word, which we know, can be overused, but I think that's the moment that I was hearing people were at. So the question then becomes, how do we accelerate action and progress? How do we build momentum? How do we get to scale? How do we activate and move towards more systemic change? So those are the big questions. And I think that the conference has already given us a lot of things to go on. So I think we're going to talk about 3 or 4 things that I think Canada and Canadians and all of us can do ourselves or in terms of advocacy towards industry leaders, government leaders, or whatever. The first one is going to be where there's traction already and momentum to build on. The second one is where we're kind of stalled or missing in action. Thirdly, are there new areas or new actors or new levers that we haven't even activated yet? And finally, I think we need to ask ourselves where we really need to have breakthroughs, where we need to anticipate big risks and setbacks and focus on perhaps some grand challenges. But let me just start with the first one, then I'm going to turn to John. I've heard over the last couple of days what I'm going to describe as 4 intersecting circles of energy and mobilization. They're around youth, they're around cities and communities, they're around universities and colleges, and they're Indigenous communities and Indigenous leadership. And these are all strong in their own right, but they're also very much, I saw a lot of interconnections and sharing and collaboration amongst them. Just this last panel, we've heard that youth in this country are on fire, and they're what a colleague of John and mine call Generation 2030. These issues are their lives and their futures. And there's so much youth activism, and much of that is actually grounded very much, I think, in cities and communities, and in their universities and their colleges and their centers of learning and education and civil society. So the cities and communities, we heard from not just from the mayor's panel, but in other sessions about how they're on the front lines of these issues, whether it's climate resilience and infrastructure or food insecurity or homelessness. Cities and communities are there, and they're actually taking action, and there are tools and pathways. A number of tools were talked about, whether it's the Tamarack Guide for advancing SDGs in your community, or the mayor in Kitchener talked about localizing the SDGs and the work there. So there's tools there, but we need to expand them and make sure that, try to get them out so that all Canadian communities and cities are activated on this. In terms of universities and colleges, there's a lot of action on our campuses. Some of it is bottom up, some of it is led from the middle, a lot of it is led from the top. And this is where research can actually create new ideas and new innovations, where the learning and the students can actually problem solve around the global challenges, and where they can serve and anchor into their communities. And I've seen this it's happening at Dalhousie, it's happening at Queen's University, it's happening in lots of places. And finally, I also heard we had a number of examples of Indigenous leadership and how we can learn from traditional knowledge about ways to, and Indigenous practices about ways to manage, whether it's the boreal forests or water conservation, nature-based solutions, inclusive governance. And this is an area where I think we can find great inspiration and great leadership that can really inform all of us in terms of what we do. So I'm going to stop there, but I think that we have so much to build on. And particularly in those 4 areas, I found that we have a lot to build on, and then we can build on that momentum and make sure that we extend it and grow it and try to get it across the country. I'm going to turn it over now to John.
Well, thank you, Margaret, and hard to top that. And I also just had the chance to listen to part of the most recent panel, and wish I could have been here for more, because from what I've heard, it is an extraordinary gathering of extraordinary people doing extraordinary things for all dimensions of the SDGs. And as usual, I'm just following in Margaret's slipstream on all of this. But I think there's a big piece also that is in what Margaret just said, of so many extraordinary things happening and so many extraordinary people doing them, but the need for a little more extraordinariness society-wide in order for this to come together in the way it needs to. And Margaret and I have written about various aspects of this over the years. And so what I want to avoid is being a broken record, but also just to flag some of the opportunities that I think are in front of us. The university movement and also the colleges and different academic institutions across the country are, in my view, the single biggest driving force right now. We have not Waterloo, early adopter and leader, of course, and the initiative there that has been so important, anchored there, but not limited in any way. But we have major institutions from down the road, University of Toronto to Dalhousie, as was mentioned, to Queens and Concordia right now in the middle of a very entrepreneurial approach to these questions over a whole semester institution-wide. And so we are seeing these forms of both intersectoral and, I would underscore, intergenerational collaboration that come together almost uniquely in the university setting, where the what I describe as the moral clarity of newer generations can connect with the wisdom and resources of older generations to chart a path forward. And so it's hard to overstate the importance of what seems to be happening on campuses across the country. And I know in many instances, although I don't have as clear a sense of it at the grade school level, there's a lot of movement as well, with a lot of teachers and a lot of students in primary, secondary school, really learning and calling for change. The flip side is we have a lot of cities, maybe not a flip side, but a complement, as Margaret said, a lot of cities doing a lot of pioneering work. We have places like IISD that are doing a lot of pioneering work, working with a lot of cities. I know we've heard from some mayors in this group, and of course, Indigenous communities across the country have been providing so much leadership kind of from before day one on this agenda. So I want to say that as a baseline for what I'm about to say. We have seen so many steps forward at the level of the federal government, which in my view are still missing the point. We have many tremendous talented leaders in the federal government structure, and I say that in a nonpartisan, all-party way, but we're still missing the point. And I want to pick one factoid that to me underscores how we're missing the point. There is an SDG funding budget of about $60 million, I think, over 13 years, and it's a centerpiece of the federal strategy. And there's a SDG unit of tremendously talented people in Ottawa who help to administer it. And I imagine many people in this room, even this event, are supported by it. So it's not to say it's not great, it's great. But if we think about what that represents in the scale of what the Sustainable Development Goals are, it's not quite right. It's about $5 million a year out of over 13 years. So I think $5 million a year, that's equivalent to roughly 12 cents per Canadian per year. That is the official quote unquote budget for the country's efforts on the SDGs. That cannot be right. And I'm an economist, so I like to do big picture math, or even if it's just a simple arithmetic. Canada is roughly a $2 trillion economy. I went back and we did a study, a colleague, Homie Karas and I, looking at what each country around the world is currently spending through its public sector resources alone on issues relevant to the SDGs. I went back and looked at it this morning. In Canada, in 2015, it was about $540 billion a year of public spending across the country on issues related to the SDGs. That is the scale of the national public sector spending on this as it is today. On business as usual, whatever that means anymore, in all the uncertainties that the world's been going through, the ups and downs, that number gets up to about 775 billion in 2030. It's an extra 230 billion a year just through natural growth of our economy. And the numbers are probably even a little bit bigger than that, given all the massive fiscal responses of the past couple of years. Now, why do I go through that? Well, if we look at the federal budget last year, it's about $400 billion. If we look at the Ontario provincial budget, it's about $185 billion. If we look at the budget for the smallest province, Prince Edward Island, it's about $2.4 billion right now. The fact that we're talking about the SDGs, which are all about what our society is trying to achieve, And we're often discussing it in the context of a $5 million a year budget. And just to remind us, $1 million is 1/1000th of $1 billion in a $2 trillion economy, means we're not thinking about it quite right. And I say that because I think it's really important that we think about all of these massive amounts of resources. And I'm not saying this in a fundraising argument, just to be clear either. I'm saying it, we have these major forces of budgets and resources in our country. We have these major questions of how they're allocated to achieve transformation, to reach marginalized populations, to innovate our way to solve the problems that haven't been solved yet. Those are massive, major levers. And if we're not having the debate there as to how to achieve the SDGs, we're not having the right debate. And we need to have the debate there and in our private sector and in our scientific sector and in our civil society sector. We need to be having the debate in all these places. And my concern is that 7 years in, we're still having the debate on the margins of our society rather than at the core of our society. And so in that spirit, I do think there are opportunities. I think that coming out of this extraordinary strain that the world and the country have been through in the past couple of years, and the extraordinary strain that the world's going through this week, it's a very important time to think about the first principles of what are the long-term consequences we want to beget? What are the positive interventions that we want to make in the coming few years to build and bend the long-term curves towards where they need to be? And I think we have a few core questions we need to be asking. I've underscored the public sector side because it's the clearest. We need to be thinking in our federation, what's the provincial role in delivering success? Every budget that comes through a provincial government is a chance to ask the provincial leaders, the ministers, the leaders of the opposition, anyone who's in the debate, how is that going to turn the tide or finish the job or solve the problem towards the SDGs in our province? When we have a national funding body, we can ask the same question. How will that turn the tide, finish the job, or solve the unsolved problem towards the SDGs as a benchmark? In our own organizations, we can ask the central question. We might advocate the SDGs. Are we in our behaviors consistent with the SDGs? Is our own organization leaving no one behind? Is our own organization manifesting the forms of coherence and consistency that we're asking for the rest of the world? How do we measure that? How do we set a standard for others to follow or partner with our leadership energies? These are the types of questions that I think not just universities can pioneer, but at this stage, the big frontier where Canada can also, and I'll stop at this, that Canada can really also, I think, lean in, is on the private sector too. Canada's in a very unique position in the world right now. Everything from very influential finance minister to the launch of the International Sustainability Standards Board office in Montreal, to the growing role of some of our pension funds on a lot of these sustainability questions worldwide, to the clarion call for specifics on what it means to have not just a sustainable business, but sustainable development consistent products and supply chains. These questions of what that means are at the forefront of how the world organizes itself, and Canada is uniquely positioned to help the world solve that problem too. So a little bit of a tour d'horizon, as they say, but also I think a kind of a stark set of figures to frame what I think is actually ultimately a pretty exciting opportunity on how this could be taken in a much better way forward. So back to you, Margaret.
Thanks, John. Maybe I'll just pick up a few thoughts and before we have to close off. I think what John's saying much better than I am, but is that we have so much to build on here in Canada, but we're not activating all of our levers, all of our energies. It's not just the budgets of governments, it's their regulatory powers, it's their taxation powers. There are big structural elements in our country that we're not tackling yet, and that need to be tackled if we're going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do what we can in our own communities, but also in our own institutions, but to advocate and to make the case for how we need to actually get to scale and to accelerate change. John mentioned some new opportunities. The world is focused, Canadians are focused, our youth are focused on climate, and that's right. But in addition to climate finance and climate adaptation, climate mitigation and new ways of producing, new forms of energy, there's a lot of knock-on issues there related to the SDGs, whether it's to do with inequities, whether it's to do with food security, whether it's to do with infrastructure. We can use the focus on climate not to overtake other aspects of the SDGs, but to open up the window to the implications and the interactions across the SDGs, which we've talked about for the last 2 days. Finally, and I don't know if John agrees with this, because we always argue, John and I, that you can't pick and choose, you can't cherry pick your SDGs, although some are more important for some institutions at some points in time, and that makes sense. But maybe we need to figure out where our greatest challenges are, where our grand challenges are, and try to mobilize our collective efforts and societal efforts around that. It's good for the federal government to produce an annual report. It would be nice to have a report card that actually documents and with data that shows how we're doing on each and every one of those SDGs and where we most need to have a breakthrough, new ways of working, new ways of collaborating. And that could then maybe focus on the 2 or 3 greatest challenges that we're facing. And if I could have a final thought, and this is something that we've talked about before as well, John and I, Canada, we're talking here about the SDGs in Canada and how important they are for us to resolve our own issues, but also to become the society we want to be. But we also have a responsibility to the globe. And there are a number of SDGs on which Canada has a disproportionate both responsibility and opportunity to help the world achieve the SDGs, whether that's our boreal forests, whether that's the Arctic, whether that is our coasts, whether that's just the ingenuity and innovation that Canada can bring to these issues. We have an obligation not just to our own communities and to our own families and to our own nation, but there are areas where we can make an extraordinary contribution to the world. And I think that's another part of what Canadians need and I think are thinking about. So maybe I'll stop there. I don't know that there's, John, if you wanted to add anything more.
I would just add 2 final points. One is, I think if we had an annual scorecard of every province and territory that kind of allowed the competition instinct to kick in, who's doing better than others on these issues, that could be a powerful device that the communities online today might be able to contribute to. So, I'm from British Columbia. People care how they're doing relative to Alberta and vice versa. There is that vibe. And then similarly, I do think there's a very special ingredient. And, the current government in Ottawa is obviously led by the Liberal Party, and I think we have a very special ingredient with someone like Minister Gould at ESTC, who's very talented. I have no problems. I'm a big fan of her personally, but also I think having served in the international development role previously to connect these dots. But crucially, it's so important in Canada and so unique and so understated that it's a Liberal government following through on agreements that were forged under the Harper government. It's not partisan what we're trying to achieve. What is partisan and should be is how to get there. Politics is about debates on how to get there, but there's actually all partisan agreement under the hood on where we're trying to go. And I think that's such an important element for the Canadian debate that's a special. In addition to federal politics, which are complicated and crucial, they can be a crucial complement to the provincial politics, which I think are the single biggest piece that needs to be mobilized for Canada to move forward. including because so many of the private sector regulatory conversations are provincially driven. So lots of key pieces, but I think ultimately I remain excited and ultimately I remain inspired by everyone who's on the line today, and continue to be ever more inspired. And I do want to thank the younger generation that we were just hearing from beforehand. I remember fondly when I was the younger person, and now I'm just reminded of how not young I am and how so much of this counts on, really and sincerely, the energy, drive, and ingenuity of intergenerational collaboration in order to move forward. So thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Margaret et John, pour ces réflexions-là. J'espère que ça nous a aidé à terminer de bonne manière.
For your thoughts.
So, alas, we have come to the end of the main programming for Together Ensemble. We hope that these past 2 days have inspired you in your work and our ability to come together across sectors to push for the SDGs. And remember that this conference is but one of many actions being taken for the SDGs in Canada. Bien que j'espère que vous avez appris beaucoup pendant notre temps ensemble, c'est mon plus grand souhait qu'à la fin de nos 2 jours ensemble, vous soyez remplis de désir de reconceptualiser la société à l'image de toutes les différentes identités qui vivaient et qui n'ont pas encore vécu
all identities express themselves.
Dans le clavardage, veuillez mentionner si votre vision du monde a changé.
Let us know
si
if
oui,
your vision
comment.
of the world has changed, and if so,
Et d'ailleurs,
how?
quels sont les sujets qui manquaient?
In fact,
On a entendu et
what
on
are
a
the
appris
topics
beaucoup à travers
that
tous
we
les tables
didn't
ronds et
broach?
tous les
We
orateurs
learned a lot
oratrices
during the
qu'on a entendus.
roundtables and through
Mais
various
quels sont les sujets
speakers, but
qui manquaient?
what are the things
Par
that
exemple,
we
moi,
may
j'aurais
have
aimé
failed
écouter une
to
session
broach?
sur
For
l'importance de nos
instance,
langues
I
et
would
les
have
ODD.
liked
Qu'est-ce
to
que ça veut
have
dire
a
être
session
un
on the
pays
importance
bilingue dans
of
un
language.
contexte
What
de
does it mean to
développement?
be in a
Et avec la
bilingual country in
réutilisation
terms of
des langues
SDG, and with the
autochtones, comment
revitalization
pouvons-nous
of
créer des discussions
indigenous languages,
multilingues
how
pour
could we
bien
have
avancer
multilingual
ensemble?
conversations to move forward
Thank you for
together?
joining these conversations, and we look forward to continuing our work together over the coming year. As a reminder, we have many fantastic side events organized for day 3 of the conference, starting at 10 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, which is 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 7 a.m. Pacific Time, and 9:30 a.m. in Newfoundland. And you can find information about these events on the Together Ensemble website, and you can access them right here on the main stage by just logging back in for the conference tomorrow. Pour terminer, les artistes for real climate action
Artists for
offrent un
Real
atelier
Climate
sur l'activisme
Action
digital pour le climat.
have
Dans cet
a
atelier,
digital
les cinéastes
advocacy
primés
for
et les
climate activism
professionnels de la
workshop.
création y présenteront leur processus de
Professionals will be
création de
showing
campagnes en ligne.
their
L'atelier
process
sera animé
for
par Sandy
online
Crawley,
campaigns. It'll be
membre
hosted
fondatrice
by
d'Artists for Real Climate
Linda
Action,
Crawley,
avec
who
3
is
autres
the
membres de
founding
l'organisme.
member of
Lisa Robertson, cinéaste
ARCA,
primée,
as well as
Gord Rand,
Lisa
acteur,
Robertson,
dramaturge et
Rand,
cinéaste.
and
Lisa
Lisa
Repo-Martel, actrice de théâtre et de cinéma primé. Et oui, so this will be where I bow out. C'est un grand plaisir d'être votre maître de cérémonie.
It was a pleasure for me to be your MC, and
une bonne
I wish
continuation.
you all a great end of your day.